Thank you, Hugo. And without further ado, we'll talk about the 2024 Hepatitis B guidelines. So these guidelines were launched on the 30th of March, just a couple of months ago. And I would encourage you to just screen the QR code because it's quite hefty, it's around 200 plus pages. And there are also web annexes that really detail the systematic reviews, the 15 systematic reviews that went into these guidelines. And also it documents also the decisions around the grade methodology that WHO uses as well. We also published together with the Lancet on the impact, on the potential impact of these changes in these guidelines. So just a reminder about the distinctive features of WHO guidelines and how it differs from other guidelines in this field, in the hepatitis field, which are made generally by professional associations. The WHO guidelines really is more targeted towards low and middle income countries or resource-limited setting, however you want to apply it. As generalized concentrated epidemic settings, we target the audience towards decision makers, national programs, but the guidelines are also really useful for practicing clinicians, civil society, communities that are working in this space. We use the public health approach, and which is really teneted on simplified and standardized approaches, and we use the principle of preferred regimens, so procurement can be simplified. And the grade for approach, which looks into feasibility, equity, and user friendliness, acceptability, and resource use. Really importantly for WHO guidelines is really that we involve the people that we are serving, which is low and middle income countries, program managers, and community members and affected peers and civil society are also part of the guidelines committee representation. Now, hepatitis B, it's kind of a new program. The first guidelines for hepatitis B globally was released in 2015. Now, we are now today in 2024. You will say, what happened over the last almost a decade now? So, in 2020, there was also a fairly significant update on the use of antiviral drugs for prevention of mother-to-child transmission for hepatitis B. But why the need for hepatitis B guidelines today? It's also because we have still major gaps in testing and treatment update. Hugo talked about the substantial 304 million people with viral hepatitis B and C living with hepatitis B and C across the whole world. There are 254 million people living with hepatitis B. And we have only, to date, the latest reports, only 13% are diagnosed, and only 3% have received treatment for hepatitis B. So we still have a really long way to go. So these major gaps help us to necessitated a relook into what the guidelines were doing. The other thing, we had a lot of complaints that the guidelines were complex. So in these guidelines, we have progressive simplification. And over the last almost a decade, there were starting to be studies with research, with communities and national programs that looked at regional differences, both in demographics and epidemiology. What we realized is that 25% of all hepatitis B positive people in sub-Saharan Africa were less than 20 years old. We didn't know that when we started it in 2015. Liver cancers are happening at a much younger age in sub-Saharan Africa. There was also emerging evidence of ongoing hepatitis B DNA integration and how it causes liver cancer. There was a significant rate of ongoing new infections through mother-to-child transmission of hepatitis B in sub-Saharan Africa because most countries do not have a timely birth dose of hepatitis B vaccination. There's now more cohort data also from other developing countries. And we've been working near a decade trying to get access to hepatitis B DNA in most low middle income countries, and there's still access challenges and cost is still very high. The uptake of birth dose in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in many regions, still lags behind. We are nowhere near the coverage in many regions of that 90% that we are aiming for. So just to highlight that in 2015, we had the first guidelines, and in 2020, WHO came up with the new evidence of use of tenofovir, the antiviral use for prevention of mother-to-child transmission, and this became really part of the triple elimination of mother-to-child transmission of HIV, syphilis, and hepatitis B. So now to the ingredients of the new guidelines. There are several key topics that are really significant in these guidelines, which are 6 areas. There are 29 recommendations. 14 are completely new because of the new evidence. So the first recommendation is on non-invasive tests for liver fibrosis. So we have, since 2015, recommended the use of APRI, the APRI index, as the preferred non-invasive test to assess for the presence of fibrosis or cirrhosis among adults in resource-limited setting. We have now also included transient elastography, which could be preferable non-invasive test where resources are not a constraint, because transient elastography is still fairly expensive in most settings. The new recommendation in this area is really to include the staging of fibrosis of F2. If there's an evidence of significant fibrosis, and this is based on an APRI score, or using transient elastography and cirrhosis of F4, and then basically these are important diagnostic criteria for fibrosis. Secondly, what is really significant for this guideline, and this is, I would say, almost a paradigm shift, is really about who to treat. The treatment is now recommended to all adults and adolescents aged 12 with chronic hepatitis B, including pregnant women and girls and women of reproductive age. So those 4 criteria that you see, it's an all. So it's rather an evidence of significant fibrosis, which is 20 to 25% of those that are infected, or the presence of hepatitis B DNA more than 2,000, and an ALT level above upper limit of normal, which is 20 to 35% of those that are infected, or the presence of co-infection, such as HIV, hepatitis D or hepatitis C, family history of liver cancer or cirrhosis, immune suppression, comorbidities such as metabolic-associated steatotic liver disease, or extrahepatic manifestations. This is about 5% or 5 to 8% of those infected, or in the absence of access to DNA assays, if you see in the clinical setting persistently abnormal ALT levels, and this is about 20% of those that are infected. So you can see that instead of one criteria, we've expanded to fairly a broad range of criteria that can be adapted to many clinical settings in different countries and at the different levels. So the key message basically from the expanded treatment eligibility is really now focusing on who to treat. So we include all age groups. It will mean many more people that can get into treatment, and the decision point will be at the clinical level. It will also mean that many more pregnant and non-pregnant women can be provided treatment for their own health, and not only access to antiviral drug use only for pregnancy. So these 4 and/or options for meeting the treatment eligibility will capture the very significant, almost 50% of all hepatitis B infected people versus 8 to 15% previously. So very importantly is the use of non-invasive tests, the EPI and the transient elastography, which is really about trying to pick up earlier fibrosis so that we can reduce risk of liver progression, cirrhosis, cancer, and death. Really significantly is for the first time, WHO also has now the modeling techniques that can help countries and explore the impact of changing this criteria and what it means to treatment needs. Why do we do this? It's because every government, every national program will require decisions on how much drugs to procure for that year. It's to be practical. So this is all available, and we have looked at the different countries and looked at the impact of changing all the different parameters. So from the original 2015 algorithm to the 2024 new algorithm, you can see that there are really changes in the algorithm. These are all in a QR code, and I would highly recommend you to have a look at that. And really importantly is, even with treatment and assessment, is really the monitoring. And particularly where there is cirrhosis and fibrosis is continued monitoring for the risk of development of liver cancer. The third is actually on first-line antiviral therapies, the drugs themselves. As you know, in 2015, we recommended the use of entecavir or tenofovir or TDF as the preferred regimen. Now, we also recommend tenofovir with lamivudine or tenofovir with entricitabine as alternative regimens. So there's also new recommendations for the use of entecavir or TAF to be recommended for people with established osteoporosis and or impaired kidney function, and for children and adolescents where treatment is indicated, entecavir more than 3 years and TAF more than 12 years. Now, why did we do that? Because when we did the systematic reviews, where we looked at dual therapy, so the combination tenofovir with FTC, or versus the tenofovir monotherapy, there were similar outcomes for hepatitis. But what it does mean is that in many low and middle income settings, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where mono drug, the tenofovir, is not available in procurement because they have procurement of the dual drugs, that means that you can also use the dual drugs to treat people with hepatitis B. The next recommendation, which is fairly significant, is on prevention of mother-to-child transmission of hepatitis B using antiviral prophylaxis. So in 2020, for the first time, based on new and emerging data, WHO recommended the use of tenofovir to prevent mother-to-child transmission when the DNA is more than 200,000 or with a positive hepatitis E antigen assay. So the new update is that for this year is where you have, or where countries don't have DNA nor E antigen testing, you can consider giving tenofovir as a prophylaxis to all hepatitis B positive pregnant women. So what it does is, of course, the use of DNA is still important, but that also opens that in settings where you can't get the test, any of the tests, you can consider to provide tenofovir for the prevention of mother-to-child transmission for hepatitis B. And this should be given to during the second trimester of pregnancy until at least delivery. Really importantly, I would like to remind is that it's not just the drugs. In prevention of mother-to-child transmission of hepatitis B, the anchor still remains the coverage of hepatitis B timely birth dose, the vaccines themselves to the baby, and the completion of hepatitis B, because this is the most cost-effective. And triple elimination, where most countries are working on, would be a very good platform to make sure that we have more integrated service delivery for mothers and to monitor the cascade and the outcomes of the baby themselves for HIV, for syphilis, and for hepatitis B. The next recommendation, really, it's on point of care DNA testing. So when we first launched, or where countries launched the programming, it was based a lot on laboratory-based testing. But now we have point of care nucleic acid testing assays. There are alternatives in our market. And really importantly is that point of care and reflex hepatitis B DNA testing really encourages a high uptake of treatment initiation. Really significantly also this year is the new recommendation, and this is completely new, on hepatitis delta. Because we started to recognize that some countries have a very high co-infection rate of hepatitis B and D, where progression of the liver disease is much, much worse, and cancer as well as liver failure. So the serologic testing is recommended, and countries can decide whether they use the universal testing approach or the priority population approach in countries that have a high carriage or high co-infection background. The available commercial anti-hepatitis D and molecular PCR assays have good diagnostic accuracy and they correlate well. The only thing around this space is that there's a limitation in gold standard assays, and we don't have an RDT right now. So when countries actually decide on the testing and all reflex testing of hepatitis delta, we need to really look and understand what the laboratory part would be. So there is a strategic choice for countries to think about what to use or where to use laboratory-based assays and point-of-care net platforms. And there is an opportunity for using the multiplex testing platforms as well. Now, lastly, in terms of implementation, there is no country that has actually scaled up hepatitis B testing and treatment as a public health approach well. So we are still fairly nascent in our global response, regional and country responses for hepatitis B. But we have seen that there's a range of hepatitis B service delivery model. What is important for service delivery for hepatitis B is, the first is move treatment out from just tertiary specialist centers. We need to decentralize. There is 254 million people with hepatitis B. We don't have that many GI specialists and hepatologists in the countries. So it's important to make sure that we try to decentralize and get GPs trained as well at the primary health care. So in implementation priorities, today in every country, every region, we have similar challenges as well. But most importantly is, like HIV, is test, 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 test. Test in any potential opportunity in all health programs, in other health programs, so that we can do case finding and link them into treatment. And really importantly, it's about education and involvement of the communities and civil society and capacity building of healthcare workers, because hepatitis still remains quite a gap of education for healthcare workers. I'll stop here. I would like to thank you and just remind everyone that World Hepatitis Day is on the 28th of July, which is Sunday. And WHO will be having the webinars on Monday, and we welcome you to the webinar, the global webinar for hepatitis. And we'll celebrate World Hepatitis Day soon. Thank you.